Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew. I'm the forum's chair of ADG, and we're here in New York City with Dr. Sheila. And today we have a panel on climate on the African continent, turning words into action. And so for the words section, we have Dr. Sheila, who's an expert in climate communication. And for the action section, we have both Dr. Samarin and Dr. Ellie, and both of them are practitioners on the climate finance side. And so Dr. Samarin is from the African Development Bank, and Dr. Ellie has worked a lot with fostering entrepreneurships and startups on the continent. So we're really looking forward to the conversation. This is in partnership with the Columbia Global Center in Nairobi. Thank you everyone for coming and enjoy the discussion. Feel free to put questions in the chat or also to raise your hand during the discussion portion. Thank you very much for being here and looking forward to a solid dialogue today.
Hello, everyone. I think it falls to me to set a little bit of a context. But first, let me just introduce myself briefly. My name is Sheila Ochuboju. I am a science communicator, a scientist, a bench scientist, genetic biology. I studied genetically modified viruses for biological pest control in Oxford more than 20 years ago, and then went into science communication because it's one of those frontier technologies that requires a lot of public engagement. And through many years of working with different agencies, UN, UNEP, UNDP, etc., UN Habitat, I find myself now working for the Alliance for Science, where it's a perfect marriage of working with scientists and also my passion, which is communication, because I believe that communication is a bridge to everything. And climate change is one of those areas where we wouldn't be where we are today without great communication. It's a really complex subject. It's hard for people to map changes that are over decades, centuries, and to actually understand that there's a pattern. It's very difficult for people not to, because we as human beings like to take an optimistic view of things. The weather is changing, well, that happens. But then, okay, it's changing 2-3 years in a row, okay, well, that happens. It takes a long time for us to understand our impact, to understand that the new normal is dangerous and affects us in ways that we really have to begin to make changes. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Africa and climate change, the statistics of it and the story behind sort of a few of the figures. And then I'll introduce our panelists who are going to talk about the financing aspect. So we're looking at words into action. And climate change is a place where there are a lot of words, and we're now at the stage where we're recognizing that we need to accelerate on actions. We've done a lot of research. We understand the complexities, but implementation of activities that are actually going to get us to a 1.5 degree world is still slow. There is no more time. And for continents like Africa that are adversely affected, adversely impacted by climate change more than other continents, this is really an alarm call. We're really in a disaster zone scenario. So the African continent has contributed only about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, far less than countries like China and the United States. Yet African countries rank as the most vulnerable in terms of the impacts of climate change. Our weather is unstable. We're faced by droughts, storms, floods. You hear them recurrently, the droughts in Mozambique, the floods in Mozambique, the droughts in Kenya right now that are putting nearly 6 million people on the edge of famine after nearly 6 seasons of failed rains. And these events have been more frequent over the last decades. So there have been about 85 recorded events since the 1970s, covering since the 1970s. And now there are over 540 events just between 2010 to 2019. So the amount of extreme weather events is more than doubling. every year. And in Africa, it's caused nearly 1 million deaths, and there's an economic value actually been put on that. The economic cost to the African continent is $3.5 billion in terms of the cost of climate change. And the cost is in many areas. African countries rely on agriculture. Most of our agriculture is rain-fed, 80% of it. And so food security is under threat. And many of the farmers that are producing the food on the African continent are not aware of climate change in the way that many of us who study these things are. They're aware that rains are failing. They're aware that the impacts are greater, but they're not aware. They're not clear on what they can do, what adaptations they can actually make. And so year after year, farmers continue to go about business as usual with fewer and fewer yields. So there are innovations, there are opportunities for innovations and technologies that are helping smallholder farmers and agriculture in general. Irrigation, drought-resistant, drought-tolerant seeds and varieties that are high-yielding. But it takes communication to get this message through to smallholder farmers, to change practices quickly from traditional practices and to begin to adapt even cultural adaptations, especially with pastoralist communities, because open grazing is not able to sustain livelihoods in the way that it used to before. So you're finding that over 20 million Africans are being pushed into extreme poverty. Over 280 million people are running out of food. And displacement of people in terms of climate migration is getting greater and greater, and it's causing conflicts. We're seeing in countries, especially in the areas of the Sahel, a lot of conflicts between herders and pastoralists, herders and farmers. And so a lot of those conflicts are climate-induced stresses because of lack of resources. Countries are being put under stress. You're seeing GDP loss in countries like Sudan, up to 32% loss by 2050. And it's just going to get worse and worse. I don't want this to be a doomsday scenario. I want us to have a conversation about actions. And so when we meet every year at the climate action, at the climate talks, we will now be meeting this year at COP28. What we're usually talking about are who are the countries that are emitting and which countries are, what kinds of adaptations need to be put in place. We've had conversations and negotiations around loss and damage. And now we're beginning to discuss carbon capture as perhaps another pillar, perhaps another opportunity, because perhaps mitigation, adaptation is not going to get us to a 1.5-degree world in a short space of time. We're looking at how can we make a green transition and create jobs and livelihoods at the same time. Can these technologies that are on the forefront, these innovations that many people are discussing that can rapidly capture carbon from the atmosphere, can they give us opportunities to at least retard the acceleration towards a 1.5-degree world? So this is some of the conversation we'll be having. There's been a lot of financial instruments that have been put in the global mechanisms to help developing countries to adapt to climate change. But the question has been, how feasible is it? How easy is it for developing countries to draw down on that? And when they draw down, how easy is it for them to implement and actually reach those most in need very quickly? These are questions and conversations that we're going to have with our two panelists. So I want to first of all invite our first panelist. Let me get up on board. I want to first invite our first panelist, Dr. Olufonsu Somorin, who I met briefly in a carbon capture conference in Nairobi. And he will tell you a little bit more about himself, but there are many innovative and dynamic policymakers, decision makers, experts on the continent who are really looking at how we can shift the narrative of Africa as the victim towards Africa as an innovator and Africa on the cusp of finding solutions that it can offer the world. And I'd like to invite Dr. Onu, please, to say a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheila. Good evening, everyone. Greetings from Nairobi. Am I quite audible? Can you hear me loud and clear?
You are. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I love conversations around climate actions in Africa, particularly with probably people in my generation or the younger generation. And the reason for that is largely because there is, to set the scene into this conversation, we have to be reminded of the notion of intergenerationality when it comes to climate change. And why is that? Because the generation that caused the problem is not the generation that is dealing with the problem. So on the cause side, there's a bit of that generational time scale, if we may call it that way. In the same vein, the generation that will take actions today may not necessarily be the generation that witnessed the impact of those actions. And that speaks to the long-term scale of mitigation as well as adaptation. And I think it's very important that we're able to bring this conversation to young leaders, students, to be able to understand that we're doing something that has a long-term horizon. And it's important for all of us to be part of this conversation, particularly under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So we all have responsibilities, even if the capabilities are different, but we have common responsibilities. And I think it's very important to be able to establish that intergenerationality concept when it comes to climate change. The second part of it is linked to finance. Maybe I should pause here and give a bit of context to myself before I can talk about finance. I work for the African Development Bank. I lead the bank's work on climate change and green growth across East African region, which covers about 13 countries. And the regional office is here in Nairobi. I've been privileged to be involved in climate change pretty early. So I started climate change in 2005. I got my PhD 10 years ago, and I was looking into governance of climate change within the context of the Congo Basin. And some of the work that we did then, 10, 15 years ago, around REDD+, coming back now to be very useful for the work we're doing on carbon finance, issues of permanence, and we'll get into that. And within the bank, I'm directly involved in the design of projects. So for us at the bank, we don't have climate change projects. We have climate-informed development projects. So basically, climate action, it's mainstream in every development project. And the team that I lead does that work. So across every sector of interest for us, we make sure that elements and activities and components of climate change are mainstream in there. And ultimately, part of the development finance goes into climate actions, basically climate finance. And we've done this very over the last few years. I've been 12 years now in the bank. And at the bank, we have a special focus on adaptation. We have a deliberate bias towards adaptation. And of all the multilateral development banks, we are probably the only one who has achieved that level of parity when it comes to climate finance flows. Now let me come back to this question of finance. We have a finance crisis when it comes to climate change. And that crisis is not coming from inadequacy of capital. So money is not necessarily scarce when it comes to climate action, but money is not evenly distributed. And if you ask me, climate change is more of a leadership crisis Because at the global level, we have been able to solve problems at the scale, and perhaps not even up to the scale of climate change, with a very good leadership sense, and money was not an issue. For some of you, and you and Dr. Sheila, thanks for the numbers that you gave. Actually, the African Economic Outlook for 2022, and please, it was focused on climate change. And for all of you listening in, please look for that report, it's online. And we estimated that anything between 5 to 15% of Africa's GDP, depending on the country, is the cost of climate change on the ground. And for some countries like Mauritania, it could be up to 25%. In Sudan, it's also in those double figures. And that is the cost of that impact. And it impedes Africa's accelerated development. And it's at the very core, at the very center of our food security, at the center of our economic transformation, at the center of social and livelihood systems on the ground. So it is not a change we're trying to understand. It's a change that is changing us in a very significant way, and we cannot ignore that. And I think, and yet, there are other crises. Many of you may know this. So we're talking about to implement the nationally determined contributions. This is like the blueprint document of climate actions we need in Africa on the high side. But on the low side, we need $1.6 trillion to $3 trillion annually between 2020 to 2030. Please take note of these numbers. And let's use the low base, $1.6 trillion every year up to 2030. And you will ask someone, is that a lot of money? And I think some people here may think, yes, it's a lot of money. But let me put things in context. I may help you to understand why it's a leadership crisis. Within the first 18 months of COVID, developed countries spent $22 trillion in responding to COVID, whether in the welfare packages or in the investment that went into research. Within 18 months of COVID-19, we spent $22 trillion. Today, the top 100 commercial banks globally, the top 100, they control assets worth $120 trillion. And today, we have some of the countries, some of the asset managers, some of them that you know, private capital flows, who are managing the financial assets in trillions of dollars. So what we claim to need to address climate change, to get this 1.5 degree, is nothing compared. So the quantum of capital needed in the global financial system is available. We don't need to wait to do more trade, to make more profit, or to print more money. No, absolutely not. The biggest challenge is distribution. And please keep that in mind. The biggest challenge is distribution. And why is that a challenge? Because we need to be able to move money from where it is most abundant, perhaps less needed, to where it is most needed and less abundant. Does that make sense? So yes. Think about a polarity in the world of finance. There is money in some part of the world, and it's extremely abundant. A country called Norway has a population of 5.4 million people. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund of $1.4 trillion. Now, a sovereign wealth fund is not the money you spend on a yearly basis. It's not your annual budget. It's not your infrastructure budget. It's the money you're keeping for the future generations. It's like a parent leaving an asset for the child, and then you put that into business. So money is not scarce. Money is just unevenly distributed. So what we are doing in the world of climate finance is how do we create what I call a facilitation modality to move money from where it is most abundant, perhaps less needed, to where it is most needed and less abundant. I want to pause there, Dr. Sheila, because I want to understand if that makes sense. Everything we're doing in creating new instruments, in building partnership, because money does not exist in a vacuum. Money is nested in partnership. It's nested in what we frame. If we frame something to be a problem, and our approach to it is different from if we frame it to be an opportunity. So money is very political, and it's important to understand. Let's be clear about one thing. It is not scarce. It is, we have the quantum in the global financial system. I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I bring in Professor Ellie, let me just note some of the things you said so that we'll come back to them in the Q&A. The issue of intergenerationality is really important. And because you're quite right, we are the generation that are going to leave a world that will either be uninhabitable or will be habitable for future generations. And what are we aware of that responsibility? Who's holding us as this generation to account? Are we holding ourselves enough to account? And how are we doing that beyond the talking at COP? So that was an important point. And yes, I love your language of possibility. Money is not scarce. It's also the same thing, food is not scarce, and yet people go hungry every day. So it's a conundrum. Yes, money is not scarce. Yes, the resources we need are not scarce. It is a distribution problem. But as you've said, it is a leadership problem, because how do we unlock that finance and create a bridge and at least allow flows from where it is not most needed to where it is most needed? It seems like a simple question. It isn't simple. You're talking about a paradigm shift in global economic systems in a certain sense, unless all of us develop an extraordinary conscience overnight. Not sure how that's going to happen, but we'll come back to that in the Q&A. I just wanted to highlight that. And you said two or three things that I think are also worth noting. It is a change that is changing us. Now, there is a possibility. The change is changing us. Will it change us enough to change our attitudes, to change our cultures, to change our behaviors? It may do, and maybe therein lies the possibility that climate change in itself will change us as the human race in the way that we behave. And you brought up an example of Norway as an example. Yes, countries like Norway, those richer countries have been icons, really, in terms of how they model their finance. And so what can we learn from that? Why is it that Norway can do it and many developing countries are nowhere near doing that? What is it? So I just want you to hold that before we get to the Q&A. I want to introduce Professor Ellie now. Dr. Duncan Ellie-Ochieng, our brother from Nairobi, is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Business and Management in Nairobi. And he holds a lot of experience and expertise with SMEs, credit financing, and he's going to talk to us today about some of the work he's doing around entrepreneurship and development finance. Welcome, Professor Ellie.
Thank you, Dr. Sheila, for that introduction. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are. I'm keen on working with entrepreneurs, especially on scaling up on innovation, and that we do through youth entrepreneurship. Getting that we work with young entrepreneurs, especially on the Youth Entrepreneurship Accelerator Program. And some of these activities involve coming up with climate tech solutions, which we are trying to scale up. But on development finance, we are running the African Development Finance Journal and the Africa Development Finance Conference here at the University of Nairobi. And financing climate change is a topical issue in some of our themes in development finance. I want to restrict myself to look at possible financial solutions that developing countries should try to pursue in trying to address this problem. But as I always believe, Africa is the least polluter, but the biggest contributor in terms of consequence they're the ones who feel the biggest consequence of climate change. Now, there is a lot that has been going on globally, and therefore, when I'm looking at development finance for climate change, I want to classify them into two categories. In terms of international finance, and then in terms of domestic finance, which the developing countries themselves are either developing or already in place. Now, for the international finance sector, there's a lot of effort towards climate-focused development finance. As development finance institutions, like where Dr. Somoni is, give us, as developing countries, support for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. And these come in form of several range of financial institutions, instruments that include loans, equity investments, and even guarantees as we pursue projects that try to address climate change mitigation or adaptation. Key amongst these funds is the Green Climate Fund, which comes from the developing countries to reduce greenhouse emissions and adapt to climate change. And this has provided support for projects that are related to renewable energy efficiency, and climate resilience. There's also the Clean Development Mechanism, which is funded by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this has allowed countries in investing in emission reduction projects, and they receive certified emission reductions in return, which then helps them to reduce their own emission reduction targets. But there are various activities in developing countries, especially in Africa, where countries are thinking about starting on green bonds, which are debt instruments issued in our capital markets to finance projects that have positive impact on the environment, including forestation, renewable energy, and energy efficiency projects. And these bonds are not only issued by governments or multilateral development banks, but they can also be issued by corporations that operate within the countries. There are also markets that have received climate funds, which are public or private sector funds that are focused on providing financial support for climate mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. Like we have the Green Climate Fund, Climate Investment Funds, and the Adaptation Fund. Now, in the carbon markets, there are efforts to activate carbon markets by implementing emissions reduction projects that generate carbon credits. And this is accompanied by carbon credit and a carbon pricing mechanism. There are also efforts towards results-based financing, where finances are only provided as incentives for achieving specific outcomes that are related to climate change. So if a country commits to reduce gas emissions or increase renewable energy generation, then that is when they get results-based financing for their private sector. And these initiatives are used to encourage the private sector to invest in climate-friendly projects. There have also been efforts towards risk mitigation, especially on insurance and guarantees, to help us reduce the financial risks that are associated with climate-related projects. And this has seen development of climate insurance products that cover losses from natural disasters like floods, droughts or storms. And this can also be useful for small businesses and farmers in developing countries where there is prolonged drought or sometimes crop failure due to inadequate rainfall. Then African countries have really adopted microfinance institutions, and there is need for us to understand the contributions of microfinance in this space of climate finance, because they also lend and provide savings accounts and insurance accounts to help the small scale players, especially on building resilience to impacts of climate change. I'm looking at a solution like providing somebody with adequate water tanks from their microfinance for saving for a rainy day. So that would be some of the products that I identify in developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Eli. That was really enlightening. And yes, once again, you're showing, you're reinforcing what Dr. Olu said, which is that money is abundant. There are many funds. There's the Green Climate Fund, there are adaptation funds, there are green bonds, there are market incentives. And so I guess we have to ask ourselves, where is this money? Is it virtual? Where is it? Why is it trickling down? How do developing countries unlock it? And what has been the effect and impact of these funds to lives and livelihoods on the ground? Because they're not new. So I think that's one of the things, because when we hear that these funds are there, it's like having money in the bank, but you've forgotten your PIN number. So, you know, how can we actually access it? So yes, I think I'll put that to you, and then I'll go to Dr. Olu to perhaps answer the question of unlocking finance and changing livelihoods on the ground.
Thank you very much, and indeed, thank you, Professor Duncan, for some of those good insights, and particularly just helping us to understand the range of instrument possible. Colleagues, every time we talk about climate finance, please take note. We need to talk. You talk about three things. The first one on climate finance is a question of adequacy. So it's a question that, is it enough? You know, and that's a question that speaks to the source of it, you know, the source and the target. And it's in terms of basically the quantity of it, you know, is it enough? The second pillar, the second question of climate finance is a question of effectiveness in terms of, is it a quality finance? Is it new? Is it additional? Or are we just calling blue fund, red, green fund, you know, are we just coloring fund finance? And that question of effectiveness is very important. Is it also the fund that generates impact on the ground? You know, are you able to build the capacity and this required institutional framework to appropriate this capital? Because it will be interesting to note, and I think we need to be honest, right now, as we complain about the lack of adequacy, we're still having a situation where 23 to 57% of climate finance are not disbursed in the first 3 years.
Yeah.
And we have ourselves to blame for that. So there's a question about effectiveness. The third point on climate finance, it's a question about innovativeness. And that talks about how do we do things differently? And I'll give you an example. Today in Africa, we're really complaining that we don't have enough adaptation finance. And yet adaptation is our biggest need. We've placed a policy priority on adaptation, and yet we don't have that. And one of the reasons why that is the case is because only 99% of all adaptation finance flows in Africa are happening through two instruments: concessional loans and grants. So when you look at the menu of instruments that are possible, equities, partial risk guarantees, partial credit guarantees, carbon market, when you're looking at payments for ecosystem services, all the forms, the diversity, even the world of debt, that's alone, you have mezzanine debt, you've got junior debt, you've got senior debt. All of these instruments in Africa, we've tested about 11 of them for mitigation, whereas we only have 2 for adaptation. So it's very important to unpack climate finance along those 3 pillars: adequacy, effectiveness, and innovativeness. And then we begin to pick one after the other. When it comes to the questions about triggering impact, because now we're talking about, turning our words to actions on the ground, then we need to speak to the effectiveness because it connects the adequacy and the innovativeness part. And to a large extent, it's not enough to complain that money is not adequate. It's also important to understand that money or finance, whatever you call it, whether it's a personal finance, it's a corporate level or development finance, money moves in 3 directions. Money moves in the direction of a solvable problem. It's very important that whatever we consider to be actions are problems that are solvable to the point that they create market opportunities. So whatever innovations we're thinking about, they should be market creating innovations. And they are there, whether it is how we manage the forest, whether it is how we practice agriculture in a particular way that is consistent with climate objectives, or how we enhance value chains of agricultural systems, or how we connect production of water to food security in a way that you keep capital flowing and you're able to expand from one market to another. There are those innovations, but the question is, are they market creating innovations? Are they solving problems to the point that they are creating economic opportunities? Money, number 2, moves in the direction of partnership. Look, even the normal thing we call public-private partnership is a partnership. When you buy and sell, it's partnership. When you buy a bottle of water, and the moment you create a mindset that this is partnership, we put on the lens of partnership, enable to create that opportunity. And I think in Africa, we haven't done that well to create partnership. Look, it's not even partnership between North and South, between developed and developing countries. We here in Kenya, the cooperatives, the SACCOs, they call them SACCOs, the local cooperatives, and Professor Duncan, you know this, sit on a dormant capital of over $4 billion. What if we can trigger that within this country to move that from a dormant capital to a productive capital? I mean, the pension capital of many African countries is a dormant capital that we can leverage on. And so it's very important that we shift our mindset around partnership to be that facilitates the flow of finance. It's not necessarily, we're talking even within a country, from capital market to local communities on the ground using technology, and those possibilities are there. And the last part is that money flows in the direction of capacity. You know, if you develop the capacity to manage capital, you present yourself an opportunity to be given a higher level of capacity. And I think it's very important to understand. You know, today we hear things like those who have projects will tell you we cannot find money. And those who have money will tell you cannot find projects in the same country, in the same space. What is the problem? The mismatch is because the language of capacity are different. For somebody who has a project, will tell you, look, there's a proof of concept. But for somebody who has money, he says, but you haven't shown me that it's investment ready or you're bankable. So it's very important to be able to bring that capabilities and capacities to the level of project management. Today, developed countries are saying, well, you keep asking for the $100 billion that we promised. And we have shown you that we've given $80 billion. But out of that $80 billion, what have you even used it for? you haven't even disbursed them.
Yeah.
And so it's that conversation, and it is not it triggers from global to local. And that conversation, it's all about raising that interaction between the demand side of capital and the supply side of capital. We don't have a problem of projects. We just need to become a lot more business-like. And I think it's very important in the African context. I don't believe in giving people grants all the time, because you could feel comfortable to the point that you feel you're entitled to it. But if we are going to be given a grant, let that grant trigger other forms of capital. And those are some of the experiments we've done with blended finance in order to be able to pull capital together to a point where you can de-risk the project, and ultimately you can then do things on the ground. Final point, we have a lot to benefit from cooperating together than competing amongst ourselves. So there's a shift that must happen from competition to cooperation. Businesses are better when we aggregate. When you have everyone wants to have small pieces of thing, we just create unnecessary competition, and at the end of the day, we don't get that scale of success that we need, or that scale of impact. Because in the African context, keep two things in mind. We need to achieve scale. We need to do that at speed. Scale and speed, it's very important. And if we're going to achieve both, then we need to completely reinvent the way we do things and do things differently. I could talk about this tomorrow, but let me keep quiet here.
Thank you. I'll bring in Professor Duncan now, because the points that Dr. Oli has raised are really about the bridge between the problem and the capacity. And I presume you've seen a lot of examples of that working with young entrepreneurs, and perhaps you can give us some examples of how some of those green entrepreneurs have been able to access finance, bridge the gap, and find solutions.
I need to indicate, Dr. Sheila, that just as Dr. Olufuso has indicated, on the demand side for climate finance, we don't have a shortage of projects. So if you look for innovative projects and had a good structure of pricing the finance for the demand, the users of the finance, then you will not lack projects, because the innovations are all here. But it is on the supply side that there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. The supply side tend to rely a lot in limited public finance. Public finance is shrinking over time as governments become larger with a bigger appetite. And therefore, there might be need to rethink on tapping the private sector finance. Now, private sector finance, and I've given you a few solutions, possible solutions, require innovation and incentives. Innovation, incentives, and adequate returns. Now, if policymakers have to take this seriously and incentivize holders of private capital to invest their private capital in climate finance related projects at good rates, then we will get innovative solutions to our climate finance problems. We have, like last year, I learned today that a student who won climate tech solution is from this country, having made sanitary pads from banana leaves. And this fellow was able to tap 1 million Kenya shillings, $1 million US, another 100 million US funding. So that is innovation alone. So the ideas are there, the projects are there, the funding might be limited, And this is because the owners of the capital have not seen reward for why they should put the capital in those innovations. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, since we are mostly discussing a lot of innovations around Kenya and Nairobi, I have to bring in the example of M-Pesa because that is an example of solvable problems that allowed money to flow and partnerships. Actually, M-Pesa is not, it's not so much about the innovation. The innovation is wonderful, yes, but it was the way it was created, the partnerships that unlocked that innovation were quite innovative at that time. And the way policies were created to allow the problem to be solved. And so I guess that's kind of where my question is. So we want solvable, we want solvable problems. We see problems that can be solved. We want money to flow. We need certain types of partnerships that have to be incentivized, and we need to build a certain capacity. And so for an innovation like that to work, you have to build the capacity of the end user, who is the Mama Mboga, who has a non-smartphone and has to have a capacity to be able to receive the money and to understand how this flows. And you have to make it easy. You have to make it accessible. And you have to build that capacity for the money to flow right down to the end user. So it's possible. And then by having those mobile money solutions, now you have a platform where many other solutions can come on board. And I was excited to hear about some new partnerships that are on the horizon in Kenya, where they're looking at smallholder farmers. So you're able to look at smallholder farmers. Satellite data tells you the soil type, the crops that are growing, the weather data. You can link that to risk financing and insurance. And you can then, if you're really clever and get the right partnerships, not even have to do much, just fly over an area where a farmer, this farmer is growing maize and the rains are going to fail. And then this farmer is going to need money. And this farmer's an M-Pesa number. And you have an insurance for that farmer. That farmer could get a payment immediately. And that farmer could be incentivized to perhaps grow different crops, try different varieties, simply by the financial instrument itself incentivizing their behavior. So that we can do it. We can bridge the problem of capacity by the way we use our technologies. I guess the thing we can't, and the solvable problems are there, the thing that really is the stickler is the partnerships. And because partnerships is about real people, it's about trust, and it's about people seeing win-win-wins. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Olu to say a few words before. I think we have 3 questions in the Q&A. I'd like to ask those. One is about leadership, holding leaders to account. How can we hold them to account for the degradation of our natural environment? And also, I guess, again, distribution. We advocate for equal distribution, but advocacy, as I know in communication, is never enough. You need some other sort of push. So, any comments?
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. And I think it's very interesting that you raised an example of M-Pesa, and that is always going to be a perfect example for the longest. Because, I mean, guys, let me give you a little bit of context. M-Pesa is just 16 years old. It was established in 2007. Now, it will interest you to know that about 20 years before then, the level of mobile technology penetration in Africa was less than 1% of the total African population. So we moved from this old analog stage. Within a short period of time, the continent embraced this mobile telephony technology. And we didn't just stop there. We became the pioneers of innovation. And because what happened 16 years ago in M-Pesa triggered that innovation globally. And it's today's the least thing you can use it for is to move money, because it's almost like a connector of ideas, of market opportunities, and all of that. Now, if you ask me one single word that would define that success, I'll tell you is leadership. Some other people will say partnership, and I think they're both linked in that way. And what we need to think about is, and I saw the question about, how do we hold government responsible? That's my starting point. We need to change that. There is a type of leadership that is possible outside a government structure. We call it governmentality or government. Outside of governmentality, there's a type of leadership that is possible. It could be through ideas. And today, with a continent that has 70% of its population below 30 years, you've got young people who have access to technology, who can drive innovation. And we've seen that with the social media platform. So it's very important to begin to think about ideas that can travel through boundaries, that can travel through, that don't need visas. And that technology helps us. So, and I think, I always ask myself, why do I do these kind of lectures? Last week, I was in King's College, and I was really talking about this in London, and I said, look, we need to mobilize a new generation of young people who have a sense of identity, who see themselves to be part of the solution. And me talking here is part of my agency in doing that. And I think it's very important to begin to look at where are those entry points of possibilities. And today, we also understand that even though mitigation is not a legally binding responsibility on Africa, we recognize that we have a role to play in solving a global problem. And we even have an opportunity to do that as we move towards our own development. And that is what the carbon projects are triggering. And within the value chain, it's important to see where can we come in? How can we use technology to connect verification agencies with projects? How can we make sure that revenues get to local people? That is all of us exercising our agency in one way or the other. Whether you're physically here or you're far away, there is a role to play. So I want to close on that. Let's move beyond governments. And because, as the people are, so the leaders, our leaders represent us, so it's important to create a critical mass of young, forward-thinking, embracing type of leaders who are able to help us to achieve that scale at speed. It's really important. And I'll keep it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to, I think we're about coming up to time. I would like to share one slide, if I'm able to enter, which comes from, oh, no, I'm going to not, that will cause feedback. I want to share a graphic from the IPCC report, because it speaks to what you were saying, Dr. Olu. And I found it interesting. IPCC reports are the foundation of all climate negotiations, the basis upon which we discuss climate. And they are, sad to say, very dry documents. It's very hard to get emotional about it or even to understand the effect. And so it was nice to see some graphics this year that gave you, I felt actually moved when I saw this graphic. Because it showed that where we are at 2020, how the world is heating up and the legacy we're leaving for a child born in 2020, entering into this world by 2100, how horrific it is. I mean, it's all red. This is the probability of the world that we're creating. And so there were very few graphics, but they tried this year at least to do their science communication really well. And it showed some of the challenges which we talk about: water availability, health and well-being, city settlements. So I urge you all to read the summary of the IPCC report for policymakers and to try and unpack it and to try and make meaning of it. That's my job at Alliance for Science. We try and make meaning of it. We try and tell the story of the child born in 2020 what's that life going to be like in this new world that we seem to be foreseeing. And I also urge all of you, if you can, to read a book called Ministry for the Future, which is a fictionalized account of what the impacts of climate change. And it's horrific and emotive, but it tells us a story that the data is actually speaking to. So I just want to close and thank you for inviting us, our generation, to speak to this generation that is equipping itself with knowledge to begin to address this. You're the future leaders. These are going to be the problems and the challenges you inherit. We believe in you. We trust that you have enough passion and innovation to be able to find solutions. And we are here because we want to contribute to your journey to a better future. Professor Duncan, Dr. Olu, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you again. There are many things we didn't touch on. We didn't touch on carbon credits. We didn't really touch on one of the things that you should watch out for, the Climate Action Summit in Nairobi in September. And so it speaks to what Dr. Olu spoke about. The president of Kenya has said, yes, the challenge is speed, scale and speed, that's it. We want action, we want no more talking. So he's holding a pre-COP summit that is just about actions and just about speed and scale. So keep an eye out for that. We're going to be doing a lot of communications around that. So it'll be lots of graphics and lots of videos and very much more easier to digest. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.